Welcome to Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities. I'm your host, Dr. Michele Reid-Vazquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afro-Latinidad. Venga. I am thrilled to welcome today's guest, Dr. Danielle Terrazas Williams. Dr. Terrazas Williams is lecturer of the Global South in the School of History at the University of Leeds in England. She has held fellowships at Princeton University, Cornell University, and the Huntington. Her award-winning research has appeared in the Americas, the Journal of Women's History, and History of Religions. Her forthcoming book, The Capital of Free Women, Race, Legitimacy, and Liberty in Colonial Mexico, will be published by Yale University Press in April 2022 and is available for pre-order. Her work challenges traditional narratives of racial hierarchies and gendered mobility in Mexico's understudied period of 1580 to 1730. Only one generation removed from slavery, free African-descended women owned businesses and land, served as influential matriarchs, managed intergenerational wealth, and even owned slaves of African descent. The book posits that the same regional openness that fostered their ascent throughout the 17th century eventually led to their financial and therefore archival marginalization by the second half of the 18th century. Thank you so much for joining me today, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
My pleasure. So let's just jump right in. So you grew up in Richmond, California. How did your early life shape your professional interests in Afro-Latin American communities?
I think growing up in the Bay Area, especially as someone of both African-American and Mexican-American descent, growing up in a African-American and Mexican-American neighborhood in Richmond, California, I really thought about these two communities for a very long time. But I didn't really see, for example, what I did in school as something that I tied to my own scholarly interests, right? So I felt like I was taking history classes, even in high school, and I was much better in math and science, and I didn't feel that connection. But I started really thinking about, for example, what I was doing sort of outside of the classroom. My great-grandmother was a school teacher, and my grandmother had inherited many of her books. And so I was reading about Black history on my own, sort of in the privacy of my home. And I didn't see it as, oh, this is what historians do, because I felt like, well, in my high school classes, that's not what I saw happening as far as the stories that I wanted to read. So I would say, early on, I didn't really make that strong connection between, my own interest in the history of Black people and Mexicans and my reading in my house, and then, sort of what I did for school. So it really didn't come until I was in college. I sometimes meet these people who said, I always knew I wanted to be a historian, and that just wasn't my case at all. In fact, I thought I would become a lawyer. But what I realized about what I thought I really enjoyed about law was piecing together disparate pieces of information to make the most credible narrative. And then I said, oh, I could actually do this as a professional historian. So that sort of changed my trajectory. But it wasn't until maybe sort of junior year in college where I started thinking about, pursuing a PhD and what it would mean to have, the opportunity to pursue histories of Black people.
Great. I wanted to ask you, I wanted to go back a minute. You talked
Sure.
About your upbringing in the Bay Area, in an African-American and Mexican-American community. I just wanted to know if you could say a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was such a beautiful benefit to be from, both of those cultures and be surrounded by those cultures, right? So even, when I was in private school, it was predominantly African American, a couple of Mexican Americans, a couple of white students, but I think that being surrounded by other families that looked like mine, that had similar traditions, that had similar cultural references, that it was just a wonderful a wonderful opportunity to think through both Mexican Americanness and African Americanness, which was quite different when I sort of went to college. And then, I wasn't raised around people who were, Afro-Latinos, right? And so, other communities were, for example, if you go down to San Jose, there are more communities, for example, of Puerto Ricans and specifically Afro-Puerto Ricans, but that really wasn't my reality growing up. So going to Cornell University, where I was around so many Caribbean folks from, all over, whether they were born and raised in the islands or from New York City or from the greater tri-state, I was just like, oh, this is Blackness within, the Latin American context. And whereas I grew up in a setting where it was African Americans and Mexican Americans, and those communities sometimes having conflict with one another, but the community I grew up in, I didn't really see that. I saw us living next door to each other, knowing each other's families, playing in the same, parks and things like that. So it was a little bit different. So going to college sort of brought on this new lens, this new experience of having people who had grown up in sort of Afro-Latinidad.
Excellent. So I'm thinking I can see kind of all the pieces coming together. So I know you're really passionate about centering stories of Black women, especially their kind of daily efforts in the colonial Mexico period that you study, but also their daily efforts to rebel and resist. And I'm hoping looking forward to you telling us a little bit more about why you were drawn to these areas, to this topic.
Yeah, I think it really, I think about my great grandmother, Annie Ruth Johnson, who's from Greenville, Mississippi, who owned a funeral parlor, who was a school teacher in the segregated South. And knowing her as a child and thinking like, wow, she's just such a dynamic woman. At that time, in the final years of her life, she was also blind. So she was also a disabled Black woman who had, lived this such dynamic life. And I wanted to know more about Black women's history, and had spent much of that time sort of early on in my early years thinking about other African American women, and then sort of transitioning to think more diasporically and wanting to see, what the history was like for Black women in Mexico. And it really came about because I wanted to do a project on the history of Black people, and a mentor of mine at Cornell said, well, why don't you focus on Mexico? The language, the culture. It's, it sounds like a good opportunity. And so here I was saying, okay, let's see what they have in the archive. And I started with the Notarial Archive, and I was finding all of these rich stories, and also just, sometimes just sparse references to Black women's lives. And it just drew me in, and I knew that that's what I wanted to do, is to write the history of Black women. And so the Capital of Free Women, Race, Legitimacy, and Liberty in Colonial Mexico focuses on a constellation of these really daring women. Some narratives are from as early as the 1580s, and sort of end in the 1730s. But I think one of the things that really struck me was their resiliency across the board. What did it mean to fight for your rights in front of colonial authorities who owned women and people who look like you and your family members, right? What does it mean to sort of show up in those spaces and feel like you had a right to be there? And again, I sort of think back about my own great grandmother who grew up in the segregated South, U.S. South, and say, what did it mean to fight to be a Black woman entrepreneur in such spaces, to be so visible, and also to be, also vulnerable in many ways. And so these are the types of stories that I was finding, and I was so compelled to share them, that I started this type of research when I was an undergraduate at Cornell. I was part of a college scholar program in which you were allowed to sort of create your own major and pursue your own research, and they had wonderful opportunities for mentorship. And I'm so grateful for that program, because it really, I was able to sow the seeds of this lifelong commitment to the history of Black people in Mexico. The first project is about Black women, but the larger questions of resiliency and the everyday acts of resistance that we get to see through something as sometimes can be mundane as the Notarial Archive was really compelling. And I'm again so grateful that I'm able to share these stories.
So are we. I'm wondering too, because you mentioned your great grandmother, I'm wondering too if there's a particular woman in the archival records that you were looking at that remains with you, that her story really speaks to you.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to a woman that I encountered when I was, I think, 19 or 20 years old when I first found one reference to her. And actually it was her story initially disoriented me because I found her while I was looking through manumission records, and the project at that time for this BA program was just tracking manumission trends. I was really curious to see, who was manumitting whom and when and how often, whether there were any cycles and trends that I could follow throughout 17th century Mexico. And I found this case of this woman, and she's noted as a mulata libre. And I was like, is that true? Is she a Black woman who's freeing someone here? And it really, I sort of stopped because I'd only been encountering Spanish slave owners at that point. And so she really struck me, and I really sort of step back and say, like, okay, what was her life like? And surprisingly, which we all know, as for anyone who does work in the colonial period, that usually it sort of ends there because there aren't enough, follow-up materials. But unlike many others that I then encountered many years later, there was a good, body of documents to follow her story and her family story. And this is a woman named Polonia de Rivas, and she was a mulata libre, a free mulata, and she owned her two siblings, her two, what we may call half siblings. She refers to them as the hijos de mi madre, which is a very specific designation, instead of just saying hermanos.
Exactly.
But she refers to them as the children of her mother instead of just her brothers. And she also owned sort of countless other slaves. I don't have an exact number. I know she had 3 slaves that are documented, but then she also dowered her daughter for an untold number of slaves. And so I'm not sure, sort of how many slaves were accounted there. But she was a woman who, what does it mean for a free Black woman in 17th century Central Veracruz who is unmarried, has daughters, she does have a son as well, and who is never identified, again, as like a widow or anything like that. Her mother she identifies as born in Guinea. Of course, that designation could mean a couple of things, but her mother was born in Africa, and that her mother was enslaved, and yet she is a slave owner, and she owns her 2 brothers. And this very complicated woman, has stayed with me, for now almost nearly 20 years, because of how dynamic, her story was, and how complicated it is, and what does it mean, what does family mean in this context? What does her own sense of her vulnerability mean in this context? Why would she choose to make these choices? And so I wrote an article about her story in 2018 in the Americas, and then was able to find additional materials to include to expand that story for the book. So actually, unlike many other women where I only have, sometimes only a few pages to talk about them, for Polonia de Rivas, I actually have a full, developed chapter just for her in the book, because I guess because I felt very sort of close to the story at that point, and I really felt like any details I could add, that she deserved to have her story told, and in as much detail and life as I could give it. So she's someone that stayed with me for quite some time.
That's wonderful that you're able to find so much material and to make her a central component of not just an article, but also of the book. And so I'm really looking forward to that being available to the general public. Now, as a scholar and an educator, how then would you say that your work contributes to our understanding of kind of broader Afro-Latin American communities, especially in this colonial period?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been so much great work. I mean, not just for Mexico, but so many other places as well. Of course, for Cartagena de Indias or Lima or Peru more broadly by people like our colleagues Michelle McKinley or Nicole von Germenton, Ria Elena Martinez for Mexico, Tamara Walker. I just think of so many wonderful scholars, Marlene Kars, for Dutch territories, that what I wanted to add to the legacies of the history of Afro-Latin American history was an earlier period that focused on women who we might consider of sort of a middling economic range. Oftentimes, I refer to them mostly as women of means. Some are indisputably wealthy. They're multi-generational landowners. They own slaves, they own businesses, they own very large homes, and some, are, very new to life as free women. But one of the things that I think is important about the work that I do is to offer sort of the dynamism of this moment, of this changing landscape and specifically of this site that they're in, Central Veracruz, which at the time is a place in which, sort of all of coloniality is arriving to, forced to, and encountering one another. And specifically for these free Black women, which I wanted to focus on for this particular book project, is to think about what would it have meant for them in, the early 1600s to survey a landscape where, slavery was not on its way out. There wasn't a horizon that they could imagine. And I talk about this in the book that, their choices in life chances are dictated by the fact that they're experiencing where, you don't have this long legacy, for example, of freedom movements that are emerging, for example, throughout the Caribbean. There's no Haitian Revolution to say, there's something that we could look beyond. But there's a great legacy of marronage in Central Veracruz. It was always an active site. And so they're also negotiating that space. So what does it mean to be a free Black woman, knowing that you're in sort of an area that has high Maroon activity and having to negotiate a Spanish context, Spanish authorities, as they likely look at you with suspicion, right? And I think that dictates a lot of the choices. So again, I think that one of the things that I wanted to add was an earlier period to focus on free women and free women of means, which I, was much more familiar with the historiography for a later period, the late 18th and then of course the 19th century in places like the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, also in places in what became the US South. But I think that my emphasis on this earlier period in Mexico adds something to the conversation, adds these women's stories that I hadn't, read about before. So.
No, absolutely. I mean, again, I think in a lot of ways I certainly focus on the late 18th and 19th century, and there's a lot of material there. And so sometimes I stop myself and go, well, what was happening before, a century or two earlier? How might it connect?
Yeah.
As you point out, a lot of times there's been less research done on the earlier periods than the later. So I'm so glad that you're shedding some light and understanding on these women, and again, in particular, these women, free women of color, of means, as you describe them. How unusual is that in that time period? And again, because we see it remains fairly unusual throughout the rest of the time period, again, depending on where you're located and all of that. So I think these are important issues as you think about gender, as you think about upward social mobility, access to economic resources, all of those pieces.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've, really always enjoyed about reading across both time periods and spaces and empires is, for example, I think about, what my work does is extend the legacy, backwards in time.
Mm-hmm.
And it always sort of shocks me to see the similarities that I have in the cases that I see in the late 16th and the 17th century with cases in the 18th and 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about Jessica Marie Johnson's book, Wicked Flesh, and the final chapter of her book focuses on a Black woman whose marriage is questioned. It's actually questioned by essentially her sister-in-law. And the last chapter of my book focuses also on Black women whose marriages were questioned. Now, unfortunately for the two cases that I focus on, I don't have any idea who sort of questioned those marriages. But again, sort of the continued vulnerability of Black women that, their marriages can't even, there's always something that's suspicious about Black womanhood according to colonial authorities. The fact that they were even willing to listen to the accusation, even for the case of Jessica Marie Johnson's, that's cited in Jessica Marie Johnson's book, that again, there's just the indignities as well, right? What does it mean to be a woman of a particular class? In my case, a woman named Maria Candelaria, who is her husband is a second generation landowner. He's also a Black man. She's a free Black woman. Their children are born free, and someone is questioning her marriage. And what would it mean for a woman of that particular class to have to confront, Spanish officials, to have to prove that, she's not an illegitimate wife and that her children are not illegitimate? Just again, the endlessness of the indignities that Black women had to challenge and encounter is something that unfortunately is a sad shared experience as I've read across again our fields and our time periods. So, but again, I do think it's also inspiring to think about the fact that Black women have been figuring out, to a lesser or greater degree, how to negotiate these spaces. And I think that's one of the things that my work more broadly engages with, is thinking about these specific different colonial institutions that have tried to circumscribe the lives of Black women, and how Black women respond to such levels of sort of the imposition on their own lives.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about even in the contemporary context. And so wondering, what would you, given your work and the way that it's situated, but also the world that we live in, what do you think are some of the most urgent issues for Afro-Latin American communities today, especially as they relate to the work that you do?
Yeah, I think that there's been for generations now, such wonderful activist work that is being done in Mexico by scholar activists, community leaders. I think about the work that Maria Lisa Velasquez has done for sort of the institutional giant that is INA in Mexico, sort of bringing just greater awareness of visibility. I was listening to season 1, and I believe it was Stephanie, is it Stephanie Jones, I believe?
Jennifer
Jones. Oh my goodness, yes. I'm mixing up Stephanie Jones Rogers and Jennifer Jones. And she said something that really just, that I held on to, which she said, I don't think we're past sort of just talking about, the importance of presence and visibility, right? And I so agree with that. Right? I just think that there's so much more that we can do about bringing greater visibility to contemporary experiences of Afro-Latin Americans, both in Latin America as well as diasporically. And if my scholarly work can help in any way, I'm very happy that it can, but I am also very grateful to so many of the activists who are in Mexico doing amazing work, for example, who really fought for constitutional recognition, which was a huge measure that's been going on for years to try to get that done for Mexico, like the constitutional recognition of Black people in Mexico. There are, constantly seminars and programs that are done by community leaders. And, what I would really like is for more people to know what people in Mexico are doing, right? That this is not something that we, for example, scholars in the US need to go in and fix, that there are plenty of people in Mexico. And I think that their work needs to be highlighted, their work needs to be centered, because they have been doing, oftentimes thankless work, unpaid labor for now generations, working on with their own communities. So I would say, visibility, awareness, and, funding measures, right? So whether there can be greater collaboration with institutions in the US that can help, advance the agendas of people who have been doing this work and have been in these communities for a very, very long time. So again, I think visibility still matters. The presencia study still matters, and I'm happy to be any part of that.
Excellent. You mentioned a few organizers and a few scholars throughout our conversation. And as we kind of come up to our final question, I like to give people an opportunity to talk about that. So in addition to your forthcoming book and other articles, what other specific kinds of resources would you recommend to people who are interested in learning more about Afro-Mexican and kind of broader Afro-Latin American communities?
Absolutely. I think, for our Spanish readers who are listening, I would definitely say, if you can access the books of Maria Elisa Velasquez, Adriana Naveda, Ursula Kamla, Citlali Dominguez. Dominguez has a number of articles that there are a wealth of scholars in Mexico producing really wonderful monographs and shorter pieces as well. That people can follow. Most of these people are also on social media and things like that, so you can follow them there. But I think that some of the best resources again are being some of the best resources are looking at what community activists are doing. There are lots of different web pages people can turn to. I would, even start with INA and looking at their website to get a sense of the program that they have going on. They always have sort of a dynamic group of people, both community activists and scholars, both Mexican as well as international scholars. So again, supporting the institutions that are already been doing this work is really critical, as well as Mexican scholars who have been part of this fight for a lot longer. So yeah, just support other Mexican scholars.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, your journey, the passion for the work that you do, and certainly reminding us to look at the work that's already being done by people on the ground in Mexico and throughout Latin America on the African diaspora in that region. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Dialogues on Afro-Latinidad, please subscribe to our podcast and tell a friend. For links to the resources mentioned in the interview, visit our website at michelereidvazquez.com/podcast.